welcome to Crimes Through Time, a weekly snapshot of crime history. Florence and Dorothy Fisher were a married couple who, despite having a lot of love and respect for one another, simply couldn't make it work. They parted ways in 1934, but remained civil for the sake of their teenage daughter Frida. Both parties moved on. Florence fell in love with a young and attractive widow, Florence Iris Ransom. She was a lady of independent means and owned a farm in Oxfordshire. As this was now the 1940s and strictly the relationship was adulterous, Florence rented a cottage in Matfield, Kent, to maintain some sense of discretion and privacy. Florence would join him there at weekends. But as the war in Europe raged and the threat of invasion became a real possibility, Florence made the decision to move into his mistress's farm full-time, installing his wife and daughter into the cottage. Bombs were a regular feature of London nights, and the ladies were living in Twickenham at the time. To keep them safe, he moved them away from the capital. He also provided money so that a housekeeper could be employed. Charlotte Saunders would join the household in that role. Florence would often visit to check all was well at the cottage. Florence became obsessively jealous of Lawrence's visits and continued concern for his family. She saw Dorothy as a barrier to her and Lawrence marrying. On the 8th of July 1940, she asked her brother, who worked on the farm as a cowman, to teach her to shoot a sporting shotgun, giving the excuse that she wanted to shoot rabbits. She had purchased 25 cartridges in Oxford and Gill and ironmongers in Oxford on the 3rd of July. At 8:56 a.m. the next day, on the 9th, Florence took a train to Bicester. She was seen en route between the cottage and Tonbridge. She was carrying a large brown package. The prosecution would assert it contained the shotgun. There was evidence that the ladies were setting up for an outside tea. Florence had obviously been welcomed at the cottage. The theory is that Florence, maybe using the story about shooting rabbits, walked with Frida, Lawrence's now 20-year-old daughter, to the end of the orchard garden, where she shot her in the back at close range. Dorothy ran across the garden, only to be chased back and shot in the back twice. Florence then returned to Frida and shot her 2 more times. She then entered the house, searching for Charlotte, finding her in the kitchen making the tea. She dropped the tray and ran, but Florence gave chase, shooting her in the head. The cottage was then ransacked, but nothing of value was taken. The alarm was raised in the late afternoon. Dorothy was expected by her 90-year-old mother, Mrs. Gibb, for tea. Her housekeeper had taken her usual afternoon off and returned at 5 p.m. to find Mrs. Gibb sitting alone and no tea had been served. Both ladies were very worried. Dorothy was a reliable person. They immediately thought something must be wrong. Their worry only increased when no one answered the telephone at the cottage. The police were called. Mrs. Gibb insisted that the house was never empty and requested what we would call a welfare check be conducted. The police discovered the tragedy that had occurred at the cottage. They moved swiftly to search and process the outside crime scenes before darkness fell. The bodies were then removed, but officers remained at the house overnight under the instruction of Chief Inspector Peter Beveridge, called in from Scotland Yard's blind squad. Lawrence was notified of the death of Dorothy and Frida and was taken to Paddock Wood police station the next day. He was interviewed at length by Beveridge and quickly cleared. He was at work the whole day and had witnesses who could attest to that. 6 shots were fired during the murders, but no cartridges were found. But the killer did leave a critical piece of evidence, a left-hand white leather glove, found between the bodies of mother and daughter. This glove Lawrence recognised as belonging to his mistress, Florence Ransom. On the 17th of July 1940, Florence was formally charged with the killing of the 3 ladies by Detective Inspector Smead. He reported that in reply to the charge regarding Dorothy, Florence replied, "I didn't do it. I didn't do it. How could I?" To the charge regarding to Frida, she replied, "No, no." She made no reply to the charge regarding Charlotte. She was assisted from the dock and walked slowly from the court, leaning on the arms of the detectives. Her trial opened at the Old Bailey on the 7th of November 1940. Florence pled not guilty. Her defence was that she had no recollection of the day of the murder at all. Her mind was a complete blank. but she believed that she had been at the farm all day. The prosecution set out its case, quote, "The facts prove," said Mr. John Hutchinson, "that she had undoubtedly been planning the murder for some time. It's not necessary to prove a motive, but it might be that having lived with Mr. Fisher, she wanted to marry him, and the wife was in the way. The most callous feature was the killing of the maid, Miss Saunders, the witness of the crime." End quote. Florence had taken shooting lessons, acquired ammunition, and eyewitnesses placed her travelling to, being suspicious outside the cottage and on her way back to Oxon. But there was two pieces of evidence that really demonstrated the premeditation behind the crime. First, the gun. The murder weapon was a single-shot sporting shotgun. It would need to be manually reloaded 5 times and the cartridges removed. It is likely that the glove was dropped when she removed it to dig out the cartridge with her finger. The action of reloading between shots meant that Florence had time to pause. Each shot then became a deliberate act. The jury would take the gun with them into the deliberation room. Secondly, the ransacking of the property. The prosecution put forward that this was done to stage the crime as a burglary gone wrong, that the 3 women were killed after disturbing someone in the house, again showing forward planning in order for them to get away with the murders. This trial was the first time in UK history that a jury was allowed to go home if a trial went over a weekend, in order to comply with new air raid laws that came into force 2 weeks prior. But the jury would take 47 minutes to find Florence guilty on all 3 counts of murder. She was sentenced to death. As is usual, after a death sentence, Florence's case was heard on the 9th of December 1940 in the Court of Criminal Appeal. It was raised on the suggestion that the judge's directions were deficient. Lord Caldecott found that there was no grounds to critique the summing up. Her appeal was dismissed. Florence did not handle the judgment well. She, quote, "became very distressed, waving her arms and making several attempts to speak. Wardresses held her hands and comforted her. She clutched the dock railings and gazed around. She had led from the court, muttering incoherently." End quote. The case was then passed to the Home Secretary, Herbert Morrison. This time her defence was trying to have Florence declared insane. She had a history of mental instability and had been a voluntary inpatient on a number of occasions, and she was described in the dock as, quote, "having strange brooding look in her eyes that betokened madness." End quote. She was certified insane, and her death sentence was respited, and she was committed to Broadmoor Asylum, where she most likely spent the rest of her life, although I wasn't able to confirm it. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments what you think of this case, and I look forward to welcoming you in the next one.